federal government has introduced draft laws into Parliament aimed at making it harder for executives to be granted big golden handshake payouts when they leave a company. The laws will mean shareholders will have to vote on any termination payment above 1 year's annual salary, compared to the current 7 times a director's total pay. The legislation comes as the Productivity Commission continues its public hearings into executive remuneration. Today, hearing submissions in Melbourne ahead of a December deadline for its final report. For their thoughts on executive pay, is it too high and should it be regulated? I was joined in Sydney earlier by John Colvin, the CEO of the Institute of Company Directors, and a lawyer who used to specialise in structuring and negotiating executive contracts. And from Melbourne by Martin Lawrence from the governance advisory firm RiskMetrics. John Colvin and Martin Lawrence, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
G'day, Ali.
If we can start with the legislation regarding golden handshakes that's been introduced into Parliament today. John Colvin, you say that 1 year's base pay is too low a benchmark for a shareholder vote. I wonder, though, why do we pay CEOs at all when they leave a company? Aren't they rewarded well enough on the way through?
Well, I think you've got to just discern between a termination payment as in a notice payment, and just about everybody has a notice period in their contract. So there's that aspect. And then the other aspect is we're talking about legislation bringing limits in, and previously we had 7 times normal pay, as in the whole of pay, and the government have brought it down to 12 months base pay, yet to be defined. And we say that bringing in such strict rules doesn't actually assist. It also distorts in many ways the way you structure, packages, which in the long term is not the best way to go for Australia.
So if it has been, well, it still is, anything above 7 times you have to vote on. The legislation is anything above 1 time. What do you think it should be?
Well, we've said in our submissions that we thought 7 times was too much. That was based on the old defined benefit schemes. We said, look, why not have 2 years full-time? That gives you a bit of headroom. For example, if you have an overseas executive and you want to employ them in Australia, their big risk is up front, so you want to have a bit of flexibility. You've also got to remember that Australian executives are competing at this level. We're talking about the top 100. They're competing globally, and it's a global search, and we put Australia at a disadvantage. US has up to 3 times, Europe has about 2 times, and England doesn't have any times. They just have a what if, Please explain.
Martin Lawrence, what do you think of that argument? And I guess also if I can put it in the context of an argument that's made not just for paying more on termination or golden handshake, but also for paying more on the way through.
There's no question that executives are to a certain extent globally mobile. If you're a good executive anywhere in the world, you'll be attractive to a range of employers. We recently did some work, though, on behalf of a client of ours, just looking at how often in reality executives of the top 50 Australian companies were actually poached by overseas employers. It doesn't happen very often.
With respect, Martin, I don't think that's the issue, because if you listen to and talk to the global search companies, they say at the CEO level for the top 200, it's a global search. They also say that it's a global search for the direct reports. So when they're looking...
With respect, John, a global search company is unlikely to say anything else.
That is a fair point. They do have, I guess, their own argument to make.
Yeah, but it could be accurate too.
Martin Lawrence, let me go back to you. Do you think 1 year, just to finish with this legislation that was introduced today, is 1 year about right?
It's 1 year base pay.
I'm quite happy to ask my employer to have a notice period of 1 year's base pay, I should add. 1 year's base pay is not the limit. If a company can make a very good case to its shareholders of why it's appropriate to pay more on termination, then absolutely let them do it, and the shareholders, if they're given enough information and a sufficiently compelling argument, will accept it. The idea, I guess, that I always find puzzling, though, is that surely if you're looking to recruit somebody and that the stumbling block in the recruitment process is that they would only join you if they can be guaranteed of a large payment for failure, surely that would send alarm bells ringing. I mean, we have had some pretty prominent examples of overseas recruitment into Australia. Someone like Paul Anthony, who was brought over to AGL on a stupendously generous package if he was terminated, justified on the basis he was uniquely talented. Well, 18 months later, he wasn't at AGL Energy anymore.
Well, it's one example, but we're talking about rules, regulation, and if you like, just constricting people into areas. We would say good boards would have that argument and they would make the appointments, they would have the negotiations. In fact, when I was doing those negotiations, if somebody came up and said, well, I want you to be paid for failure, that would probably be the end of the negotiation.
No, but I guess isn't the point that we are seeing and have seen a number of instances where after a CEO has left with a very, very generous retirement benefit, the company has relatively rapidly gone down the tubes.
Well, that's true in some cases, and there have been examples of payment for failure, and there have been examples of, probably overpayment and boards getting it wrong. But we're talking about a system which is meant to be in place for the benefit of all companies, and do we really want to have laws which are, we would argue, uncompetitive internationally and force companies into saying, well, we can't do that particular aspect. The rest of the world in the developed world they can argue and have discussions about that. We can't. We'll have to think of something else.
Well, Martin Lawrence, I know that in the Institute of Company Directors' submission to the Productivity Commission inquiry, it very much follows that line of argument that with the benefit of hindsight there's been some mistakes, but don't over-regulate, things are changing. Is that in fact right, or do you believe there is a role for regulation? And I guess the next question has to be, can you regulate without being too prescriptive?
I'd broadly agree with John that the system we've got in Australia works pretty well. It certainly is a much better system than the system they have in the United States or elsewhere in the world. There are a couple of areas, and there's only a handful of them, I think, where some regulation to empower shareholders, we're not talking about government coming in and saying thou shalt not pay more than this, but to empower shareholders and also to empower boards, because by, for example, on termination payments, saying that you can't pay more than 12 months base pay without shareholder approval, it actually empowers a board to negotiate with an executive. They can say, look, I'd love to write that contract for you, guaranteeing you that large payment, but I can't do it. You know what shareholders...
Well, we've got the legislation regarding termination payments. What would you like to see regarding broader remuneration? At the moment, there is a non-binding vote on a remuneration report. Do you suggest that vote should be binding?
No, we don't, Ali, and not a lot of people do, to be honest. It's far too broad a thing to just turn into a binding vote. One area where there used to be a binding vote and we think it should be brought back relates specifically to the issue of equity securities to senior executives and specifically executive directors. But by and large, the system doesn't need a dramatic overhaul. The issue is making sure that shareholders are able to hold boards and companies to account when they feel their interests are at stake.
John Colvin, is it as much as that, or is it more? I mean, I just wonder whether education and encouragement actually works.
And it does. The advantage that has is you educate people as to how to negotiate, what are the pitfalls. You're going to get a much better and a much better sustainable view of the market in this area. That's the best way to go. The other thing we've got to remember, as Martin's rightly pointed out, this is not America. This is not somewhere else. Australia has probably some of the best corporate governance in terms of directors and regulations and regulators in the world. We are being looked at by the rest of the world as a model. So we shouldn't throw out the bathwater just because there are problems somewhere else in the world.
I guess just to finish this discussion off, one of the issues with this Productivity Commission inquiry is that while they acknowledge differences of opinions and what they call automatic mechanisms working, i.e. if you're not happy with the company, you sell the shares, they also say that there is scope to make markets work better, and they talk about improving accountability, transparency and information flows. I wonder, John Colvin, if I'll ask you first, do you think you're going to get something quite tough out of this inquiry in terms of regulatory change?
Well, I hope not, because I think that would be counterproductive. We've seen where laws have been introduced in the United States, for example, where $1 million cap of deductions were introduced in the United States. That caused, in many ways, and in many commentators, a shift towards non-cash and equity, which then sent the executive salaries through the roof because they were being rewarded, in many cases, for entrepreneurial activity, which may not have been the agency-type relationship which senior executives might occupy.
Martin Lawrence, do you think that, like it or not, there is going to be some stricter regulation?
I would hope that there'll be a tightening up of a few of the areas, particularly around the issue of equity securities to directors, giving shareholders that approval right back. I wouldn't think there's going to be terribly dramatic change. What you might see is a greater emphasis on remuneration when regulators look at companies, and certainly APRA, for example, seems to be moving that way, but not in a prescriptive way, more in a this is something we're going to look at, take into account, but not necessarily say thou shalt do this or thou shan't do that.
John Colvin, Martin Lawrence, many thanks for talking to us.
Thanks, Ali.